It's a very sweet kitty.
Still looks like we're having a few more people get signed on, so we'll wait just a minute or two more. I do want to use all of the time we possibly can and get everything, all of the wonderful conversation, as much of it as we can.
I think it all took place on email.
There was a lot of banter on email.
Don't worry, Tamara, we can come up with new material on the spot.
Okay, good. Good.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I just wanted to go ahead and welcome everyone to this event. This is the Eavesdropping on the Experts event hosted by EDCare, and I'm Grace Filiss. I'm your moderator. I hope everyone is having a wonderful Eating Disorders Awareness Week. And I wanted to go ahead and just jump right in so we can get as much time as possible with the experts. So I just wanted to briefly go over a disclaimer. So our guest speakers this evening come to you not only as experts in the field of eating disorders, but as lifetime friends and colleagues, which you'll be able to tell right off the bat if you can't tell already. This webinar is designed to be a casual meeting of the minds, not as a formal presentation or as a CEU event. Tonight's discussion may contain the use of food, beverages, and adult language. If any of this is triggering for you, we trust that you'll take care of yourself and make the decision to either stay and take care of yourself or sign off. So thank you. I also wanted to let you know that please be submitting questions down in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. The last half an hour of the event will be all of the audience questions. So I would love to have some rich conversation happen in there as well. And I'm going to go through and introduce our absolutely wonderful panel of experts. A lot of doctors, all doctors on here, which is wonderful. So first, Dr. Beth McGilly. Her camera is going to be turned off, so you'll just be able to see her picture. Dr. Margot Main, Dr. Tamara Pryor, Dr. Amy Baker-Dennis, and Dr. Michael Levine. I am so incredibly honored and excited to be the moderator for this event. I'm also very appreciative that we have all of the time zones covered in this event. So literally every time zone in the United States is covered. So if you'd like to share what time zone you're coming from, please feel free.
Eastern Standard Time.
And Grace, I do want to introduce Ziggy, who is with me. I hope he doesn't bother anybody.
He's welcome.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's jump in with our first question. What are your earliest memories of becoming involved in the field of eating disorders?
Well, we've all chosen Dr. McGilly as the starting person. So I'm going to hand it off to her.
See, that's what happens when you're the youngest in the group.
Oh, that's right.
Sorry.
He's milking it already.
Yeah, I'm just, establishing my privilege here. Yeah, so my first memory has to do with Dr. Pryor. We had the great opportunity to work together and joining the field in the 80s. And I was in my first year of practice, and we were doing, at least I was doing my first professional talk where we had our treatment center. And we were in the gymnasium of the treatment center, and I'm watching the people file in as I'm adjusting my diapers. And I see walking in and sitting in the front row, the psychoanalytic psychiatrist who was the first person I went to see when I understood that I had an eating disorder. And in true psychoanalytic tradition, he sat in silence for the first 3 to 6 months that I saw him, never really asking me anything. And just, I felt like I could mimic his breathing, and I learned everything about his silence. He learned absolutely nothing about me. And so the best thing I ever did was fire him. But there he was sitting in the front row, and I panicked and I ran to the bathroom, and Tamara followed me. And I'm like, I can't do this talk because the psychiatrist who I first fired, who I saw for my anorexia, is in the front row. And Tamara, who doesn't remember saying this, had the great wisdom to say, Beth, you're going to go right back out there and you're going to say, never sit in silence in the face of a person with anorexia nervosa. So I was a good student still at the time. So I did that. I stood at the podium and I said that while I stared right at him. And that was a really powerful moment for me. You know, I didn't understand it at the time, speaking truth to power, but that was probably my first major feminist act as a therapist.
Very cool.
Love it.
Well, I fell into this field absolutely by accident. I was living in Columbus, Ohio. I had just been promoted to the executive director of a community mental health center in Columbus. And we were doing a lot of engaging with the community to have more community involvement in the mental health center. And a woman came in one day and asked if she could rent one of our group rooms for a support group meeting. She had been holding a support group in her house for the last 8 or 9 months, but there were so many people coming that the neighborhood couldn't support the cars. She didn't have a living room big enough to see everybody. And I said, well, you know, what kind of a support group are you providing? She said, anorexia nervosa. And at that point, this was 1977. In 1977, I'm in graduate school, and I remember a brief paragraph in the bottom of one of my psychopathology textbooks talking about this rare, non-curable thing that's, you know, I knew nothing about it. So I said, tell me more. And it was kind of like if you went to the board and asked them to give permission to do something, I was never turned down. I went with a little proposal saying they want to meet once a month in the group room. There's going to be anywhere between 20 and 40 people. There was a psychiatrist on the board who lost it that night and said, there's no cure for this. This is a very serious problem. We cannot afford to have the liability in the facility after business hours. But we were open until 9 o'clock at night, but people would be leaving the facility, you know, after the end of the group. So I went back to her after the board meeting and said, I'm really sorry we had to table your request, but in the meantime, we've got a month before the next board meeting. Could you teach me everything there is to know about an eating disorder? She said, well, why don't you go with me? I'm going to be doing grand rounds at Hopkins. My therapist who treated me was Arnold Anderson. So she was going back for a grand rounds and a weekend long medical conference, and she took me in tow. And I met Arnold Anderson, and he took me all through Gracie Clinic, and I shadowed him for 2 days, and I got bitten by the bug. I mean, end of story. I came back, told the board, not only are we going to have support groups, but I want to open a treatment program. I had done a needs assessment to find out that there was nobody in the city of Columbus that was treating it. There was one research study being done by a medical resident in psychiatry named Randy Sansone, who all of you remember. He was working with a woman named Kathleen Dixon, which was his professor. So I brought them to the board meeting. I told them this is what we were going to do. And they said yes. And so we took over the support group that Pat was doing. We took over her organization called the National Anorexic AIDS Society. And
The rest is history.
here I am.
And Amy, you created one of the best and most memorable conferences, which we called the Ohio Conference, which is probably where most of us met.
Let me take over the story here at the moment.
Brace yourselves.
Yes, I am. Thank you. So in 1979, I graduated from UC Santa Barbara with my PhD. And I was hired to teach at a small liberal arts college located about 55 miles or so from the Center for the Treatment of Eating Disorders, the National Anorexic AIDS Society. And I moved to Central Ohio, and I began teaching at Kenyon College. It's a small liberal arts college. And one of my responsibilities was teaching abnormal psychology. And I knew not a thing about anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa because I had either seen the same textbook that Amy had seen, or they just passed that photo from Krasner and Ullman's textbook around with a woman with anorexia nervosa with a black band over her face and looking starved, to say the least. And so through a coincidence, my wife was one of the founding mothers of the Domestic Violence Center in this little rural Ohio county. And they needed a token male on their speakers bureau. So guess who got volunteered? And for the first time in my life, at that point, I was in my early 30s. I had been studying psychology for a number of years. I actually spoke to someone who wasn't a student or a professor about psychology. And someone saw me give one of those presentations who turned out to be the head of the Mental Health Association in Knox County, Ohio, where I was living. I started volunteering for the Mental Health Association. There was just something about being on the radio, writing newspaper articles, giving talks in schools. We did programs about suicide, programs about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We did a lot of different programs. And one day we were sitting around the office in the downtown Mount Vernon, Ohio. And someone said, you know what, instead of doing these little piecemeal programs, we ought to do a week of programs that are integrated with the newspaper, the radio, the schools, public lectures, training for professionals and such. And somebody said, you don't mean one of those stupid awareness weeks, do you? And somebody else said, we don't have to call it that, but we should do this. And someone said, well, what topic should we do? And just at that point, the conversation was overheard by the college physician, Tracy Shermer, who Amy probably remembers, Vietnam veteran, the college physician. And he said, you need to do it on anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. And I thought that was the dumbest idea I had ever heard. As far as I knew, these were rare. I'd never heard of bulimia nervosa. As far as I knew, anorexia nervosa was a very rare disorder that, you remember, Amy, was thought perhaps it didn't even exist at all. It was considered like the infamous multiple personality disorder or folie à deux. It was a controversial diagnosis among people who thought it was even possible. Mm-hmm. And so she said, not only that, he said, I know people in Columbus, Ohio, who specialize in this. And now I thought he was joking. He said, I know a woman in Columbus, Ohio. I'll arrange for you to meet with her. So not too long after that, the head of the Mental Health Association and I took a 50-mile car ride to Columbus, Ohio. And the woman, her name was at that time, Amy Enright, now Amy Baker Dennis. The woman, I sat down and talked to her for what, 20, 30 minutes. She showed me around the little facility. Within 20, 30 minutes, I had volunteered to write a curriculum guide on the prevention of eating disorders that I didn't even believe in. And I had a PhD, and my father was a high school teacher, so I knew what the word curriculum meant, but I had never written a curriculum guide. I knew nothing. I'd never seen a curriculum guide. And on the way home from that car ride, I thought, what the? And yet we put on a week of events. It was the first Eating Disorders Awareness Week in the United States in Little Knox County, Ohio. And we brought Amy Baker Dennis and Randy Sansoni up to Mount Vernon. This is the last thing I'll mention. We were terrified because we were paying them some enormous amount by mental health association standards, like a third of the budget.
$200.
Yeah, a third of
One
the
for
budget.
Randy, one for me.
Yeah, we have a third of the budget to pay these experts to come up and do a professional training thing at the YMCA. And we arranged to have coffee and a cheese platter. And we hoped they had a coffee pot because we only had one and we couldn't afford to give it up to the training. We were, if you might remember, we were terrified that 4 people would come to this presentation. And you know what? The same thing happened at this presentation that happened when Amy described the women's support group. We expected 30 people. We ran out of chairs at 65 people, and we had to go to some other places in town while we were getting ready. To 110 professionals from the county and around came to this program. I was stunned by this. So I always tell people, they say, how'd you get involved in this? And the answer is, wow, I'm still trying to work it through how I actually got involved in this. And it really was through Amy and the conference that Beth mentioned that I came to meet so many people who shaped my life, not just my work, but the person I am. And one of those people, no question, after I met Amy, I found myself in the presence of another woman who seems to be able to convince me to do all kinds of things, and that's Margos. So I will turn it over to Margos for her side of this story.
Michael, I'd love to hear you talk. It's great to be with all of you, and I really appreciate EDCare sponsoring this tonight. I hope people can learn from it and enjoy it and see the camaraderie and the importance of relationships in all of this. You know, we know that people with eating disorders really struggle in relationships, and that's a lot of their healing, is to relate better to themselves and to learn relational skills and relational comforts and all of that. And as I was listening to both Michael and Amy and Beth, it became clear to me that we all kind of fell into eating disorders. I wasn't looking for eating disorders. I kind of fell in. I was working at a children's hospital, had done my internships, et cetera, for my master's there, and then was working. And we started to see, you know, one at a time, and then a couple, 2 or 3 together, young women, teenagers with anorexia at first, and then bulimia. And I had always been interested in gender and also the impact of culture and society and social norms on psychology, and particularly on women. So it kind of brought together things for me, and I decided that I would specialize in eating disorders. I got support from the hospital that I was working in to, with a few other people, develop a team. But I remember quite clearly that my supervisors and mentors, if you will, all told me not to specialize because eating disorders were just a fad and I would have nothing to do.
Yes.
So my partner in practice, Rob Weinstein, and I, every now and then he'll say to me, you know, when we're both like tearing our hair out because there's so many people to see and not enough time and so much to do, this is just a fad, right?
Yes.
So that's how I kind of fell in, but I also fell into a relational group that has been very important to me as well. Michael and I met in the 80s. Michael, was it 86 or 87?
86.
Okay. One of the things that happened, I live in Connecticut, and as eating disorders awareness became a thing because of our leaders in Ohio, I and someone from Rhode Island and Massachusetts and Maine and New Hampshire all would start to get together once a month to talk about awareness and what we could do, and to sponsor some programs together. And one of those people started a conference in Boston and invited both Michael and me one year in 86. And that's how we met. And oh my God, I'm so thankful to Anorexia Bulimia Care and to Pat Warner, a woman who had a daughter and came into the eating disorders world because of that need. did so much and brought people together. And it's really, really important to not only treat eating disorders, but to be networking with other people and to be trying to solve this problem. Not one case at a time, but really trying to prevent and reach out to people and improve the field and all of that. So I certainly got that from my relationships with Michael and the other people back in the day, and we're still there for each other. I'm very grateful.
Okay, Margo, I really appreciate your speaking to the relational piece of how the work that we do with our patients is so important in terms of the relationship with self and others. And that's what's been so important to me, as Michael mentioned, in terms of that the field of eating disorders didn't just give me somewhere to go in terms of my desire to help others, but it helped me grow as a person, and has been so much value. I could not have chosen a better profession in terms of a better fit for me. I feel like I stumbled into it in some ways, but I did know that at an early age. So I was sent to see a therapist when I was 15 years old, had anorexia nervosa, but the therapist didn't know that, and neither did I. And I have to say, I feel sorry if I had that person's name and address. I think he's probably not still alive. I would send him a note of apology, because I certainly didn't make it easy for him. I did not know how to be a patient. I didn't know how to do therapy. So I sat in silence for the one session that we had. But I do remember thinking, someday I'm going to grow up and I'm going to be a therapist that will know how to talk to someone like myself. And so I knew I wanted to be a therapist. I just didn't know how to get there. And then when I went to graduate school, I ended up needing money, like most graduate students. And so I needed to find a research assistantship, and I ended up with Women's Services. And my supervisor at Women's Services was a Dr. Kathy Hotelling. If you remember her.
Oh,
And she was tasked with doing these brown bag lunches where we would go into sororities and speak because they were having snarf and barf parties at the sororities. So I had no idea what this was about. I decided I needed to write a paper on eating disorders. I needed to read some books. So if you look at my bookshelf, I think you can see my journey through the field of eating disorders. And I had 4 books that I could choose from. You know, the first one being Obesity, Anorexia, and the Person Within, Hildebrook. The next one, 1978, The Golden Cage, Hildebrook. Then there was The Best Little Girl, Stephen Levenkron. There was Fat as a Feminist Issue, 1978. And there was Drowning in a Sea of Objects by, I think it was Sowers. So these were my references. These were my books. So I read every book I could find. And then we started the first support group. It was 1979 on campus for the treatment of eating disorders. And that was the beginning of it for me.
Tamara, it's interesting because one of my fondest memories of growing up in the field is I had corresponded with Kathy Hotelling because we had both contributed an article to a journal that was published.
Strange as that.
Yeah, in the late 1980s, having to do with eating disorders on campus. And I was invited by Kathy Hotelling to Northern Illinois University to give a talk. And she said there'll be probably a couple hundred people there, including sororities and fraternities, who get credit for community engagement by attending these talks. And I will never forget, 1,000 people showed up.
Oh my God.
And
What a small world.
it was the first time in my life not only had I ever spoken to so many people, but it was the first time in my life I had ever been heckled for what I was saying.
Oh.
And Margot may have heard this story before, but I stood on that stage and I was showing the slides that Craig Johnson and David Garner and Margot and other people had shown me how to put together about sociocultural factors and gender and so on. And a group of guys in the front row were calling out things and laughing and pointing and making what I would consider to be rude remarks. And my response was, suddenly I was in the 5th grade being teased about my curly hair and my large ears. And I could feel that sense of helplessness and shame rising up through my chest into my throat. God knows what my face must have looked like. And I don't know what it was. It hit me, probably was the presence of women of substance like Amy and Beth and Margot in my life. It hit me that I was standing on that stage with a microphone. And so I said very loudly, "All right." And there was a moment of silence. I think I said it so loudly, as you do when you're anxious and ashamed. You're either very quiet or very inappropriately loud. And I said, "I'll tell you what, I'm going to say a couple of things. And after I'm done, everybody who wants can leave with no loss of credit, no loss of your community engagement." And I said, and I use these now in my talks, I said, "Stand up and be counted." Everybody's contesting what I'm saying, and we seem to be vying for voice here. Stand up and be counted if you believe that women don't deserve the same rights and respect that men do. Just stand up, let everybody see you. Now there's dead silence in the auditorium. And I just ran through, made them up off the top of my head. Stand up if you believe that diversity in weight and shape among women, among men, is really a bad thing. Stand up if you believe that women's bodies are really objects for the pleasure of, and so on. I went through about 10 of these things. And that was a moment for me when I really felt that the work I had done initially in domestic violence, the literally life-saving encouragement that I'd received from Amy and Margot and Laura Hill and others, that did save my life. I say that as somebody who struggled with depression and anxiety my whole life. That life-saving, that life-affirming personal encouragement and support and love I had received came out that night in front of these people in a way that I realized what the word voice meant. For the first time, perhaps, even though I'd been working with Neva Piran, I'd been working with, I had read, feminist perspectives in eating disorders. I read a lot those days. For the first time, I really felt like I not only had a voice, I could be a voice in the existential sense. And I have remained a friend and a correspondent with Kathy Hotelling, because of course I needed a bit of processing after this moment. I had insulted about a third of the audience, apparently. I needed a moment, and I remained close to her in many ways, even though I haven't seen her in a long, long time. So when you brought that up, I feel that in my chest and throat now, but it's not embarrassment and shame. It's connection, as Margot said.
Yeah. I'm always amazed at the people this field has brought together. We have so many incredible people in the field, and we learn so much from each other, and we support each other. And I hope that we can model that for the people who are listening tonight. If some of you are, working more alone with eating disorders, that's kind of dangerous. You need to be with other people. You need to get support. and validation, and for yourself and for the welfare of your patients as well. But this field has brought together incredible people. Thank you all.
I just love hearing all of the different memories of how you all have been connected, how you got connected with the field and all of that. It's just amazing to hear all of those stories. I could listen all night long. I have another question for you. What made each of you want to become involved in national organizations such as NEDA?
I'll start that off if you want. After I got connected with Pat Howe and the National Anorexic AIDS Society, I came to understand that she was connected with other organizations around the country that were founded by either people that had suffered from the eating disorder or people who were parents of people with eating disorders. And there were 4 or 5 organizations that were up and running in 1977. And after working with her for a couple years and kind of putting together our national conferences, our Eating Disorder Awareness Week and everything, I met a young lady named Mary Paps, who was running an organization in Maryland, who was also doing support and working with families of people with eating disorders. And we identified about 30 people around the country that were involved in these organizations and said, we should get together. We should try to, consolidate and become the support, information and awareness organization. So we met, she and I put together this meeting in Maryland, in Baltimore, Maryland. And we had about 35 people from all the different organizations meet for a long weekend to map out what we could do together. Our goal was to try to collapse these organizations and put together one strong unit. Everybody had their own fiefdom. Nobody really wanted to do that. So one of the things, since we had started, Eating Disorder Awareness Week in Columbus, it had been going on then for several years at this point. And I said, what do you think about all of us getting together and trying to do what we've done in Columbus on a national level? And it was a project that everybody could buy into. So each of the organizations split up. We split up the United States into regions. And our goal was to have regional coordinators stretch out and do the things that, Michael was sharing with you, contacting every university, every school system, having the governor declare it Eating Disorder Awareness Week, having public service announcements, having people go out and talk in schools and in universities about this. And so we actually put on the very first National Eating Disorder Awareness Week in 1984. And that organization became EDAW, Eating Disorder Awareness Week, which we called EDAP, Eating Disorder Awareness and Prevention. That organization then worked together with these other organizations to take the National Anorexic AIDS Society, the Maryland organization, all these other organizations, pulled them all together. And finally, we had an organization, NEDA, National Eating Disorder Association, where the founders of all of those programs, I think Margos one of them, I'm one of them, we met and pulled together. And Michael, of course,
Yes.
Michael.
I was not there for that.
You
Not till
weren't there
later.
for the original, okay. But that's how the National Eating Disorder Association actually started. It was the pulling together of the remnants of EDAP and all of the other organizations, except for Chicago. We couldn't get the Chicago group to join us, but and it was absolutely the most powerful, exciting, getting all those brains in one room with one goal to make this like the National Heart Association for the field of eating disorders, and have a central office in Seattle and hire staff. Oh my gosh, it was fabulous. I'm sorry.
Thanks for recalling all of that, Amy. I think for me, one of the most important things has been to be able to work at a greater level. My path into becoming a psychologist, I'd been kind of a community activist early on, and then I decided that changing the culture was really hard, and developing better organizations for people was really, really hard, and that individual change would be easier. So I went to become a psychologist, and then I ended up specializing in eating disorders. And then I ended up like dealing with all these social problems and realizing like, I've got to go back to the community organizing aspect of this, because I can't just sit with the heartbreak of eating disorders and help people one at a time. We needed to really be out there working on prevention and doing like systemic kind of change, not just individual change. And, it all started with EDAP and the National Eating Disorders Awareness Week. And it's pretty amazing what we all have done. It's great. Thank you to Amy and all those people back in Ohio.
Thank you.
Oh, I'll jump in here in terms of what made me want to become involved in national organizations. I was just, I was hungry to find like-minded individuals, in terms of there had to be people out there other than me that were interested in learning how to work with individuals with eating disorders. And so I went to my first conference in 1983, and it was called the First Psychoanalytic Psychotherapeutic Conference on Eating Disorders in New York City. And Hilda Brooke was supposed to give the kind of the keynote, and it was quite a roster of speakers. I was staying in the old Barbizon Hotel, never been to New York before, developed food poisoning, which is pretty ironic being at an eating disorder conference. And when I went to the opening session, Hilda Brooke was hospitalized and could not speak. So Craig Johnson read her paper, which then became the introduction to the Garner and Garfinkel textbook. And I was starstruck in terms of being able to kind of, what I thought at the time, kind of sit at the foot of the master with these individuals that were already doing incredible work in the field of eating disorders. And so then I realized that I wanted to be a part of that community. I wanted to hope and imagine that someday I could develop that level of expertise. And so just started looking for wherever I could find a conference to attend. And of course, it was Harding University. And then it became the academy meetings, and realized that although I wanted to make an impact in my community and I wanted to just work with patients and make a difference and affect change with the individual patients, I also wanted a larger community. And I think in the early days, there were so few of us that we all, rather than it being competitive, we were all kind of clinging to one another to learn from one another. And so I realized the importance of the work that you did, Margot and Amy, and so many people in the development of these organizations, and how we could reach so many more people by joining together, by not being split off from one another or competing with one another. And so the fact that people came together and said, let's unite, because we can all have so much we could teach one another and learn from one another. And it's still something I encourage students and interns and people that work at EDCare is go to these conferences, get out there, get a feel for what it could be like to be in a community of the people that I have learned and grown from. It's been a pretty wonderful thing. So that's where it came from for me.
Yeah.
feel like connection speaks so loudly in so many different parts of eating disorders, you know, and treating eating disorders and being the people who are helping to treat. Connection just seems to come through in all of that work.
Well, you know, we've grown up together. You know, it's
Yes.
been 40 some years. I mean, I knew Michael when he had hair. And,
Yeah.
you know, we've watched our children grow up and get married. We've watched our parents pass away.
Yeah.
We've stayed in contact with each other, even through the pandemic. I mean, it's a very, very special relationship. And I feel blessed to have had this as my career journey. I really do.
I was thinking about this earlier and I meant to ask this in our practice session, but I'm wondering how many collective years of treatment are on this screen right now.
42.
Let's see.
Saw my first patient in 82.
73 was my first patient. So, ooh, God, almost 50 years.
Oh my
I got a
goodness.
calculator right here.
Yeah. You were like, what?
Let's say a lot.
A lot.
You were
I feel like it has to be
15.
over.
Amy?
Aw, I love you.
I feel like we're looking at over 100 years combined.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
easily.
Like
Over
about
100, probably 150 without me. I don't have any, I mean, I have, as I used to tell Amy, if one of the therapists gets sick at her conference, I'll just step in. I mean, how hard can it be?
Oh my gosh. Oh my God,
But
you're not gonna tell that
I'm the
story.
only person on the screen who is not a clinician.
Yeah.
Even though I've taught clinical psychology and abnormal psychology and theories of personality for 30, 40 years. One of the amazing things to me, talking about connection, I'll reiterate it. My first sabbatical, I asked Amy if I could spend part of my sabbatical at the Center for the Treatment of Eating Disorders. And she said, sure. And I thought, well, surely they've got some data that I can put into a computer and analyze, or they've got some writing I can do for the newsletter. They've got something that plays to, the 3 strengths I had at the time. And the first day I was there, I was in the little office they'd given me, and Amy said, I said to Amy, I know you've got a meeting now. Can you stop by afterwards? I have a question for you. And she said, no. It's like, no, you can't stop by. I said, no, you're coming to the meeting. And I was the first time I'd ever been to a meeting of clinicians talking about patients and processing. I mean, it was extraordinary. And they actually wanted to know what I thought, which was interesting since I figured I'll just sit through this and listen. This has been the story of my association with Amy. All these years, I'm still being surprised. She said afterwards, I know you wanted to talk to me about something, but I have something I want to talk to you about. We want to start a support group for men with eating disorders. And she said, that's a problem here in the community, men with eating disorders. And I smiled and said, of course, it's like note to self, men get eating disorders. I first time I'd heard of that, other than having read, about a historical case or two from the 1700s. I didn't know anything. And then she said, for our conference in a couple of weeks, I've arranged for you to have breakfast with Arnold Anderson. And you can kind of pick his brain about males and eating disorders because he's really an expert. Note to self, find out who Arnold Anderson is. I mean, I'm only back in graduate. I'm like back in 8th grade as assistant, monitor for the science class. And so that morning, it's, there's a conference is the morning, and I'm having breakfast with Arnold Anderson at 7:00. And I'm thinking, I've got a list of questions to pick his brain. Arnie shows up as only Arnie can. He's kind of a one-man whirlwind. He shows up and he sits down and he says, Arnie Anderson. And he said, I said, Michael Levine. And I said, Dr. Anderson. Before I could finish Dr. Anderson, he says, Amy tells me you're setting up a support group for males with eating disorders. And that was still kind of a concept at the time. And he says, great, because I need a chapter for my book on males with support groups for males with eating disorders. You can write it. Note to self, find out what writing a chapter involves. And I never did get a chance to ask him questions that I had. And I got back afterwards with all these ideas and all these things. And it's interesting, through that experience, I learned so much about support groups and so much about the field. I also met a young graduate student from Ohio State whose name is Trent Petrie. And he was working with another graduate student in the same counseling, the at that time internationally known counseling psychology program at The Ohio State, Todd Sevig. And they were looking to me for guidance. I felt like saying, you could talk to Amy, really. But I, all these years later, I'm still in touch with Trent Petrie. He's one of the biggest names in the world in the study of eating disorders, body image, and athletes. He was a varsity athlete at Ohio State. And Todd Sevig, I believe, is the head of the counseling center at the University of Michigan. Even though he was from The Ohio State, he is at the University of Michigan. So, I mean, it was extraordinary. Again, connections here and connections there that I made at a time when I literally knew nothing.
Well, Michael, this story that you were telling, and I've thought about this a bunch of times as we've been going through this evening. In medicine, there's a concept, see one, do one, teach one. And, that's sort of what happens in medicine, that they watch a case and then they do a case and then they teach about it. And I think that's almost what happened in most of our lives. I'm in a small state in Connecticut, and I did end up being able to help develop and run an eating disorder unit at the Children's Hospital. Got a lot of support from the administration, was very, very fortunate in that way. But I was all of a sudden an expert only because I was the only one doing it. And that's the reality. I hope that I earn that expertise a little bit more now, but I also find that the longer I do this, kind of the less of an expert I feel I am, because there is so much to learn. There's constantly, each person that comes to you is different and needs a combination of things that are slightly different than the last person. I had worried that treating eating disorders might get kind of boring because they're all the same. They are so not all the same. The symptoms may look the same, but they really are not the same.
Margot, I have never been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. I'm pretty organized and can do this. But I also said to myself, if I drill one spot as being where I want to know everything and, will I get bored? But the thing about this field is the eating disorder is the only thing that's the same from one patient to the next.
Yeah.
Because every patient comes in with at least 1, 2, 3, 4 comorbidities. Mm-hmm. They come in with different life stories, the biological versus the environmental, mm-hmm. and how those help to create what symptoms they have. It is I can't think of any other area in psychology mm-hmm. that would have kept my attention and my desire to understand more than this little specialty we're all in.
I agree.
That reminds me of something that might be helpful for people newer to the field, to know, and what I find myself explaining to other providers and especially to our families. When you're an eating disorder specialist, it means that you have a very strong base as a generalist. And then you go on to develop eating disorder expertise because of what Amy just said. Like, how many of us have gotten referrals and, the referring therapist says, I'm going to send the client to you for her or his or their eating disorder, and I'll still treat them for their depression, as if you could kind of compartmentalize those things. And what I try to explain to people who come to me and want developing disorder expertise is you really, really have to have an extensive foundation to go into this specialty, because you're going to be dealing with complex trauma. You're going to be dealing with, major family issues. Perhaps you may be dealing with, complex access 1 issues as well.
You bet.
So, I think the kind of training and expertise that we need to really be able to show up not only in our full presence, but with a full understanding of the complexities that will present before us. It's just so essential.
So well said.
Well, I think that at least it seems to me that it's become almost faddish to be an eating disorder therapist, an eating disorder quote expert. And, I've seen this in my own community and certainly beyond, where, people see that it's, kind of a cool thing to treat, or they see that there's money to be made in this field. None of us on this call developed our expertise because we were looking for a financial windfall. This is really, really hard work. And as Margos said, the need for community and support is vital. And I just think that it requires a really true commitment, not only to get a foundational understanding, but to stay on top of it. Because, one thing that I'm hearing as I listen to all of us is we may have hundreds of years of combined experience. We're also a field that's in its adolescence. We are really, really being asked to grow ourselves up in critical ways in the past 10 or so years around areas like Michael made, a comment earlier about males with eating disorders. That was like the first big aha. Well, there's only like 10 zillion to follow.
Yeah.
The LGBTQ plus community, underserved communities are a major problem in our field. So we've got a lot of growing up to do. So even those of us in the field forever, as Margot Mahan is famous for saying, the longer she practices, the more she knows to listen and to learn. As we develop our expertise, we become more humble to what we don't know.
Very well said. Thank you.
And I think this leads us into another question of, can we talk a bit about what do you feel like you've seen over the last 10 or so years that you were speaking to, Dr. McGilly, that you have found most hopeful or promising? And then also at the same point in time, what you were speaking to of the gaps and the barriers that we're currently seeing.
Well, I can tell you today I was listening in on a body image summit, and there were a lot of new voices in the speakers and issues being addressed that have been overlooked for way too long, most particularly dealing with, underprivileged populations that are not in the research, they are not in our treatment centers. We've got to learn to expand. I mean, how long did we all practice in this field with one place in the country where you could send a male? Years. We
Good
spent
point.
years working as therapists with male patients and had one place in the country to send them. That wasn't that long ago. So, expanding our research, our treatment, and our prevention efforts to those underserved populations, to me, is the most important thing that we've done. And we have a long ways to go. We've got a lot of waking up to do.
Yeah, I would agree. I think one of the best things that's happened in the past 10 years is the emphasis on the changing face of eating disorders, which has always been different than what was presented in the textbooks. But it's still very distressing that most people will think about anorexia and basically they'll think about white girls with anorexia when you say you're treating eating disorders. We still have a lot of education to do in the medical community and in both professional and the public as well. One of the things that distresses me at this point, I think we're doing better at identifying the different kinds of people who have eating disorders, but we're not doing better with providing treatment. I feel it's harder to access treatment for people than it ever has been, and that should not be. That really should not be. There's a lot of treatment centers. we have a harder time finding places for people to go that their insurance will cover or that they can pay for at a reasonable rate. And that's really concerning to me. So it looks like there's all this access, but it doesn't translate into getting a person into care. COVID certainly affected that in the last couple of years with so many programs kind of suffering for a while and doing virtual programs and still doing a lot of virtual programming, but I'm not sure that's always best for patients. And I mean, I think sometimes it's okay, but we have a lot of issues as a field, and it's they're not being addressed, I don't think.
I agree with you 100%, Margot.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that those of you that are therapists and have been around for a long time saw someone when they were 13 or 14 or 15. You were with them for the next 3, 4, 5 years as they were going through recovery from an eating disorder. And they graduated and you hadn't heard from them in 20 to 25 years. And then in 2020, they pop their head up, they do a Google search and find you and say, Dr. Dennis, I'm crashing, I'm burning. I need to talk to you. You remember my name. You worked with me. I recovered from anorexia. I'm now 45 years old with 4 kids, and I really need to talk to you. So all of a sudden, in a remote environment, the stresses that initiated the eating disorder that had been put to rest, all of a sudden come right back up again. And if you need to find a higher level of care for that individual during this pandemic, it's been absolutely impossible. And it's, you know, it's not the treatment center's fault by any stretch of the imagination. But if you look at the statistics that NIDA has put out in terms of the access to their hotline and the amount of increasing incidence of eating disorders during the course of the pandemic, that's the thing that has really just overwhelmed me the last 2 years.
Yeah.
I had to close my practice and put people on waiting lists. And I'm of the age I should have retired 10 years ago, but I can't do it with, you know, in this kind of climate and in this kind of environment. The needs are still there, and it makes me very sad. The positive thing, though, if you guys can remember a couple years ago when we used to see each other in face-to-face contact at conferences on a routine basis multiple times a year, we would sit together or have lunch together, look out over the crowd, and we could see all these teenagers that are sitting in the audience now that are, you know, PhD researchers and young clinicians. And we're sitting over there like grandparents. There are some really bright, capable researchers and clinicians on the precipice of moving this field forward. And it makes me happy that we've done some really good training to get them prepared to take the next leg of the journey. So,
you know, Amy, I do think certainly everything has been complicated and made more difficult over the course of the last 2 years in terms of access to care. But I also think that the eating disorder field has changed in terms of cost of care and access to care. And I think this is kind of a little bit of a controversial area to move into, but we are the only program in the state of Colorado that takes Medicaid. And I think all patients deserve care. All patients deserve access to care. But if your programs are only about profit, I mean, you know, we need to keep our programs up and running. And those of us that want to do treatment want to be able to have jobs and provide the, you know, want to be able to do the work we can do. But with all of the mergers and acquisitions and programs across the country competing for patients, it's really changed. It's really, I think, changed my experience of being in the field of eating disorders in terms of what Dr. McGilly and I had in Kansas in the early years. Here we are in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, right? But we have Dr. Catherine Zerby in Topeka. We have programs in Kansas City run by Ann Gabrick. We're in Wichita running programs. We're meeting to work together, to collaborate, to send our patients up and down the turnpike as they may be able to benefit from the care of other individuals through the course of their illness and treatment. That doesn't feel like that occurs as much now in terms of us working together in terms of what is the best for the patient. And we can't, sitting in Denver, Colorado with a huge program in our city, and if we need a higher level of care, we can't send our patients to these programs because they have Medicaid, and we can't send them out of state because most programs don't take out of state Medicaid. So I think this switch to, you know, a head in the bed and profitability has changed things significantly for our patients and their families. And I just felt the need to speak to that.
Very good.
Yeah, it's been very distressing. I'm trying not to bash hedge funds, but I'm really, really skeptical of all the buyouts, and, you know, the programs diversify a little bit at the beginning. But again, it's much harder to get people into treatment that an insurance company will pay for or the family can pay for, even though there's all these programs and all these buyouts.
Well, I want to take this opportunity to ask a couple of audience questions. The first one, this person says, I heard you all allude to community and these lifelong friendships. How would you advise current practitioners to embrace this in place of the competitive nature that appears so evident among professionals in our field? These are complex cases that need that collaboration of care. What do you think has caused this rift?
Well, again, we're all very old. Maybe some of you are into the riff of the younger population. I'm not. I can only speak to what brought all of us together. And that was attending conferences, sitting at lunch tables and being introduced to a group. I mean, when Margot and I went as a part of developing the Academy for Eating Disorders, we were founding members. There were 35 of us who met for a long weekend, and we knew each other inside out by the time that incredibly long experience of but
In Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Yeah, I'm talking about Tulsa, absolutely. And so we looked to each other not only as the only person from the city, our city, that was going to be going to these meetings. We knew no one when we were going to conferences. We introduced ourselves. We sat at tables. The other thing is, get on these organizational boards or participate in committees. The Academy for Eating Disorder has 50 different committees that you as a member of that can join. And as a result of that, you're interfacing with people from all over the world, and you now have a group of 15 or 20 that everybody knows your name, everybody has your phone number. You can meet with them when you go to a conference and sit with them. You can share research information. I mean, it has been, you know, both a professional growth and a personal relationship growth being in this field and having the continuity of 45, 50 years with the same people. It's awesome.
I'd say
Now
also,
they're all getting old and losing their hair and, you know, things like that.
I'd also say for those of you out there that are kind of introverted, but want very much to become a part of the eating disorder community, is get yourself a wingman. So, you know, definitely Dr. McGilly was my wingman, although she may deny it.
I won't deny it.
We'd sit at conferences and I'd go, would you stand up and ask this question? Because I'm too nervous to go to the mic.
True.
It's true. Amy has been a wingman for me because she's forced me to do things that I wouldn't have done. I ended up on the board of NEDA because Amy asked me if I would. She and Walt K asked me if I join, only to find out that the minute I end up on the board, they're on their way out. So I've been set up a few times to do these things. But I mean, I think that's important. I so very much wanted to be a part of things, but it was hard for me. I was shy. It was hard for me to initiate these things. So I needed to attach myself to people that were better, had the temperament and were better able to do that. And so I think finding those types of and developing those kinds of relationships are critical.
Joe Kelly's chiding us in the wings, so to speak, reminding us that there are wing women in addition to wingmen, and wing them, we should say. I just want to put a shout out to, the IADEP organization has a lot of built-in ways also. So if the Academy is not an organization that, would feel like home to you, the International Association of Eating Disorder Professionals has a variety of ways in which you can volunteer and be on committees or help with the certification process. And they also have chapters. So for example, there's an IADEP chapter in Kansas City, which gives me here in Wichita 3 hours away. Fortunately, I have good access, having been here for so long with the Kansas City community, but I've met a lot of people I wouldn't have known through the IADEP chapter in Kansas City. So that's another way. But, I think what this conversation attests to is that we all got to know each other from all different parts of the country through conferences.
Yeah.
So, never underestimate, what can happen sitting at the lunch table or in the bathroom. But, I think it was Susan Woolley who said, some of the most important things she learned was in the restroom between workshops, where the real conversations happened, in those tiny spaces between meetings. And, if you work in a small community like I do in Wichita, when Tamara left to go out to Denver, I was kind of flying solo here. So I started supervising people. And through that, I created a consultation group. And now I've got 6 therapists and a nutritionist and a physician. And we all are in solo practice. Nobody's making money off anybody. We are there to support each other and have a multidisciplinary group. So I would encourage you, if you to find people in your community who share your passion and don't see you as competition, see you as a collaborator. Create community. And if you can't find it in your backyard, then extend beyond your backyard. Find somebody like one of us out there and throw out a request and see if you can create some kind of community beyond your own backyard if it doesn't exist within it.
Can I add to that also? Having spoken at a lot of conferences over the years and having spent very enjoyable time at a lot of lunches and dinners and boat rides and all kinds of interesting things. I often hear people say, I wonder if, or I'd like to do this, or I'm just a dietitian, I'm just a social worker, I'm just a mom, people say a lot of things, or I'm just a PhD level psychologist practicing in blank, Colorado, or Lompoc, California, or something like that. One of the things that I've learned from many of the people like Joe Kelly and like, just a lot of people over the years is that really nobody's just a blank. If you're a dietitian, I will bet you $100 sight unseen that during your graduate training, you had no more than half an hour of information about eating disorders, if that. Well, there's a lot of things you could do about that would help build community. If you've got expertise now, you can contact local programs, local graduate programs, or local societies or local groups and share that expertise. You can write news, you can write copy for blogs, for newsletters, many of which are online now. Mention conferences. There are a lot of professional organizations. Ohio has a psychological society. There are lots of ways in which you can begin to speak up and out about not only your strengths and your knowledge, but also the gaps and holes that you perceive in your field or in your areas. And I think starting that process connects you in a lot of interesting ways with people. There are still people who read newspapers. There are still people who are looking for connections, and all it takes is one or two connections. And you find yourself,
Red.
you know, as Amy once told me, you know, don't think about what's going to happen when this fails. But what if I speak up and out and nothing happens? Think about what happens when it succeeds, because you just never know what happens.
But we have to, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Mom. I was just going to say, I thought it was a bad idea for me to spend my time on some sort of awareness week. And within a couple of years, it didn't take long, I had written a book about prevention, and I was up in front of a bank of microphones at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. And then it didn't seem like that many years later, I guess it was a few, but not many years later, I was having dinner in a beautiful restaurant in Prague with Tamara and her daughter and Amy and her daughter. And you think, well, it's, quote, it's a dinner. You have beautiful dinners a lot. And then it's not long afterwards, I'm back in Philadelphia with Tamara and her daughter, and we're doing a presentation together. And after that presentation, a person comes up to me and says, you know, your presentation is interesting. Have you thought about it? Now that person and I are doing, these things happen, and they don't just happen to people who've been in the field for years and years and years. I mean, that's how I met Margot, is that I listened to Amy, who didn't say it directly, but said it through her care and her expectations, her belief in me and her expectations, with none of which she said out loud. You can do something here. You've got something to contribute. Next thing I know, I'm in Boston on the weekend of the Boston Marathon. I don't get any sleep the night before my first professional presentation because there are people limbering up in the hallways and speaking Pakistani and yelling at each other. And I'm terrified for this first talk. And you know what? It doesn't matter, because I'm there and I'm committed and I'm open to making those, not only to giving a presentation and perhaps failing, but to listening and making connections. And that's the advice I would give is, yes, it's important to learn a lot in your graduate programs. And of course, it's important for you to be there for the patients who need you desperately. But it's also important, as Margot has always said, to get up and out of there and do something. And in the course of doing something, I began to, in many ways, be something.
Full disclosure, Michael, you did not run the Boston Marathon. I was there that weekend. You did not run.
Yeah. Well, I didn't win, but I will admit that.
But I wanted just to add, you know, we are suggesting that we all needed to take a risk, and everyone needs to take a risk. We always are getting our patients to take a risk and do new things and get out of their comfort zone. And we've had to do that also in order to develop as professionals. So it's all about taking a risk and investing yourself and not knowing exactly where it's going to go. But look at how it all worked out for us.
Thank you. Yeah.
We have about 15 minutes left, and I have 2 more audience questions that I would really love to ask you. So I might be, as I was threatening, being Billy Crystal a little bit in the City Slickers wrangling of you all. This question I really like a lot. What is the most important thing the community can do to support your work? and extended into a little bit more conversation of, it's interesting to hear from the experts what they've reflected on as the greatest way that the community can call for change. I have never heard all of you speechless. What is happening?
Okay, well, it's such a big question, and it's got so many caveats. The first thing that comes to mind is that I think the world has become much more aware of mental health issues in general because of the pandemic. I think that the commercials on television, spokespeople, celebrities, athletes, all the things that we've seen with the Olympics, mental health has now had a cresting wave of it's okay to talk about how you feel. And I think as a result, it is increasing awareness across general mental health and eating disorders as well. So that to me brings me great joy. I hope it can be followed with appropriate care for kids. That we had a major school shooting here in Michigan, and the trauma that's associated with that has rippled through our community, and these poor kids are dealing with that, which ticks off then, you know, the cascade of other issues, eating disorders being one of them. I'm just going to stop eating because I suffered this trauma kind of thing. So I am really, really hoping that the new level of awareness across the world at this point about how we need to attend to people's mental health will end up bringing more people into treatment and more people into the field to grow and become good therapists. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but
I think so.
I think one thing that has changed, it's always been there, but it recently has become, I think, much more salient, and that is the emergence into the field of a real presence of people in public health, particularly Bryn Austin at Harvard, and also Diane Newmark-Steiner at the University of Minnesota. And there are others, especially students of theirs, that if we begin to think of eating disorders as a spectrum of issues that not only involve what Amy said, invariably significant comorbidities, but also a spectrum of issues that not only define the disorder, but define our society as a society. How many people do each of us know who would endorse a drive for thinness, an irrational fear of fat, unrealistic beauty standards, being insecure and dealing with that through unrealistic goals that we might call perfectionist, or people who just give up because they can't be perfect? How many people do you know that have unhealthy ideas about exercise or about, I mean, these are some of the defining aspects of the nervosa in the phrase anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa. I'm not trying to trivialize eating disorders, nor am I saying everyone has an eating disorder. I'm saying that public health in particular has helped crystallize our understanding of the array of health and well-being and even existential issues that are involved in producing severe eating disorders, but also an array of other conditions that deserve our attention. And that means that this is not only a socio-cultural issue in the United States, it's a political issue. We need money for treatment, as Amy and Tamara said. We need money for research. We need money for prevention. We need people who are trained to do these things, and we're getting them, as Amy said, spectacularly intelligent and creative and dynamic young people coming into the field. This is all being pulled together by the Eating Disorders Coalition and some other organizations with a national reach. They're working and advocating on Capitol Hill. And this is something we all can do. We can contact our representatives. We can send money to organizations if we can afford to do that. We can think about the ways in which we individually contribute, for example, to weight stigma. If you are a psychologist or a doctor or a social worker or a dietitian or a teacher and you're listening in, I guarantee you, because it's true of me, you were raised and taught and brought up in environments that fostered weight stigma. It's not just middle school kids who practice these kinds of things. I mean, psychology has been guilty of this for years and so on. And so I think there's something we can do as citizens in a culture that's both personal on our day-to-day lives, political in terms of our advocacy, and professional in terms of our lives. It took me a long time to understand this, and I was blessed to have mentors like Amy and Margos and Linda Smolak to understand that not only is the personal, the political, the personal, the professional, and the political are part of, they can be a very powerful pyramid that we can build on, or a very powerful foundation. And so I think, and I'm hopeful because I see a lot of positive changes in this regard, both in terms of our profession, in terms of what kind of research is being done, and in terms of some of the laws that are moving toward, and in terms of what's going on in Capitol Hill. There's a lot of positive there, and it's something that we as citizens can support in various ways.
You know, I think we have great potential. As people pointed out, COVID has certainly brought the mental health issues to the foreground. Some brave athletes like Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles have talked about their mental health problems and withdrawn from competitions because of them. Everything has us on a really important point in the wave of awareness and education about eating disorders. And I'm hoping that it's going to turn into really new and different attitudes towards eating disorders. But I still see a lot of mocking of them, a lot of trivialization of them, and misunderstanding. And I'm really thinking, you know, we haven't gotten that far, but we have tremendous potential right now. And I'm hoping that we can kind of get to the next point where eating disorders are truly understood and no one is ever going to be mocked for that.
I just think it's such a cynical world right now that no matter what you do, someone is going to blurt and say what they're thinking without regard to anyone else's feelings, beliefs, values. It's just far more acceptable to be rude and crude and everything else. And it makes me sad. It makes me feel very old when we used to try to be polite to people, that kind of is the trend these days. And I know we see Simone Biles as a hero for what she did for, raising the level of understanding about mental health issues, even in these elite athletes. And then to see her being beaten around the head and neck for not performing at a,
right.
It just breaks my heart. But
Well, I have to say that I think that what you're speaking to, Amy, about what feels like, almost kind of so-called rude behavior, it's kind of what we've left people to. I think there are people from marginalized places who feel so long silenced, who have not had a place at the table, who've not been taken seriously. I think the pushback, as we know, any form of change kind of has to go beyond where they intend to fall. They have to kind of overcorrect. And I think we're seeing some of that. We're seeing it through social media. We're seeing it within our fields. So I think we should kind of expect it. Wasn't it Chavez Turner, Margot, who said, if you're not getting shit, you're not doing shit?
Well, she says I said it first. I say she said it first. So
Well,
I still
yeah.
think it's Chavez.
Yeah, I
It's
mean,
been around for a long time.
I think that, the means through which people communicate are so different than what we grew up with. And the tenor of that communication is probably different than what we grew up with. But I think what we're seeing is a lot of unrest, the pushback from various forms of oppression and marginalization. And so I just, we call it Midwest nice here in Kansas, but Midwest nice isn't going to get anybody very far. when you're rolling the ball uphill, when you're Sisyphus and you're still trying to make change, it's going to require some pretty loud and persistent voices. And I'm frankly excited about it. And I'm really excited about seeing our field become more expansive and embracing and inclusive.
Mhm.
So we have to stand by each other, and we have to stand up and speak up.
Okay, I have one last question. I'm hoping we can answer this somewhat quickly, obviously, because we have 3 minutes left. This question, and I'm going to add a little bit of my own thoughts on the end of it, is what are your thoughts on the cost of the IADEP certification being a barrier for clinicians to get adequate training? And what I'm going to add to it is, can you possibly give some alternative options if people cannot afford? What would be alternate options to the IADEP training?
Well, I can't, do not quote me on this, but I would feel comfortable saying that IADEP is definitely aware of this, and the issues related to the costs are being addressed within their organization. What I don't know is how. I know things like they've taken certain books off the required reading list out of concern for things like cost. So I know it's something that's been brought to their attention, and to my knowledge, there's an effort to address it. I don't know if Margot or anybody else can speak any more specifically to that, but it is an issue that I think is real and does need to be addressed.
I think back to when all of us were coming of age in the field, we didn't have IADEP to certify us and, give us an official certification. We were all just so curious and so hungry to learn everything we could that we went and found every resource that we could find. That you read every article, you read every book, you go to conferences, that if you want to become an expert, or if you want to become confident in your fund of knowledge to be able to effectively treat, then you take that on, that you take that on personally to make that happen. That it doesn't have to be that you have to spend a ton of money and have somebody give you their stamp of approval. You take on that responsibility for learning and growing and staying open and curious to have your patients teach you what you need to know in order to be helpful to them.
Well, and based on what Margot said and what I was talking about, because there is so much comorbidity in this population, and because I think an eating disorder specialist first needs to be a really good psychologist, understands psychopathology, that going and getting basic CBT training or DBT training so that you have basic general skills that go across every diagnostic category And then your eating disorder specialty on top, going to conferences or going to the IADEP meetings or whatever. That's what's going to give you the most expansive knowledge, skills, and expertise to enter our field, I think.
And I think a good therapist likes to dance.
There you go.
I just want to say that.
I think that's a wonderful place to end.
Can we add the caveat that doesn't mean dance well for those of us?
No, it
Elaine.
just means we get up and move.
Okay.
We like to, yeah.
I just want to say from the bottom of my heart how grateful I am to have been on this call and to be able to listen to you all. I have had times and opportunities where I get to spend dinners or lunches or coffee with each of you. And it's always been that I've wanted to just have other people hear these fly on the wall, be a fly on the wall in these conversations. And I think we did just that. And I can't thank you enough. So please take this gratitude from me. And I have a feeling from several other people who listened, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Grace.
Thank you, Grace.
Wonderful to see everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Well, that was great.